This episode was suggested by several listeners, Aaron, Amanda, and Loanna. If you'd like to suggest a topic, you can do so on Twitter @MorbidPodcast, on Facebook and Instagram @MorbidCuriosityPodcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. Before we get into this episode, I want to warn you that we will be discussing several deaths by fire and going into detail on the processes a human body undergoes when being burned. If this isn't something you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Also, remember that many of the victims we are discussing were people, not just victims, whose deaths have been scrutinized by both the scientific community and the parascientific community. People who have living family members who have likely had to hear all of the questions and the theories. Keep that in mind throughout this episode. That being said, on with the episode. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. With a summer as hot as this one has been, the risk of fires has been on the minds of the general public more than usual. I'm of course referring to forest fires and wildfires, but if we were back in the Victorian era, we'd be more worried about people spontaneously bursting into flames. This alleged occurrence is called spontaneous human combustion, and its true nature has been the subject of much study by both scientists and the public for much of recent history. Spontaneous human combustion is an alleged condition in which a person bursts into flames without any source of outside ignition, like a flame, ember, or spark. It usually kills the victim, but not always. Today, it's more often thought to be a misunderstanding of a death by fire, but this was not always the case. Early incidents in the Middle Ages were thought to be the work of a vengeful god. Later, in the Victorian era, author Charles Dickens further bolstered interest by having one of the characters in his 1853 book, Bleak House, die by spontaneous human combustion. Reports of spontaneous human combustion, also known as SHC, can be found as early as the 16th century. One of these is a reference to a case from the 1470s. It was reported that a young knight named Polonius Forstius burst into flames after consuming copious amounts of wine. This incident was written down by Thomas Bartholin, a Danish mathematician, in 1641. As this incident was written about over 100 years after it occurred, this case is considered anecdotal, even by those who support the existence of SHC, but it still makes its way into many books and articles on the subject. A second early case occurred in 1725 and was written down in 1763 by Jonas Dupont. In Reims, France, tavern keeper Jean Millet was put on trial for the murder of his wife, Nicole. It was thought that due to his interest in a young servant girl, Millet had killed his wife. Her body was found smoldering in the kitchen next to the stove, a pile of greasy ash, with only her legs, part of her skull, and a few vertebrae left intact. The rest of the kitchen was undamaged by the fire. It was thought that Jean Millet had set her on fire, hoping to make her death look like an accident. After being found guilty and sentenced to death, Millet was seemingly rescued by a young surgeon who had been staying at the tavern. This surgeon, named Nicolas Lecat, argued that Nicole was a known alcoholic and that perhaps the alcohol within her had caught fire, causing her death. This appeal turned the trial in Millet's favor, and he was eventually acquitted. However, his story did not end well, as he spent the rest of his life in a mental asylum, either due to extreme guilt for getting away with murder or haunted by his wife's mysterious death. This story is repeated many times in older literature on SHC, sometimes without Nicholas Le Chat, making it seem highly anecdotal as well, or at least embellished. On June 20th, 1745, the 62-year-old Countess Cornelia Zangari de Bandi of Cesena, Italy, was found dead in her bedroom, having burned to death. A pile of greasy ashes next to her unburned legs were all that was left behind. Her room was undamaged, however, it was coated in a greasy yellow film. The candlesticks near the site of her death had also melted, their wicks left standing naked and upright. An oil lamp was found on the floor nearby. The Countess was a known drinker, so again, alcohol was blamed for causing her to spontaneously combust. One of the most famous cases of alleged SHC is that of Mary Reeser. In 1951, 67-year-old Mary Reeser burned to death in her home. She was found by her landlady, who had stopped by to deliver a telegram, and found the doorknob of the home to be too hot to touch. The landlady called the police, who found Mary's remains to be completely burned to ash in her chair. Only one of her legs remained undamaged, her shoe still on her foot. Her skull was also present, but it had shrunk significantly due to the fire. One electric socket was damaged by the fire, and the clock it supported had stopped at 2:26 a.m. The rest of the room showed no signs of burning, but several plastic objects seemed to have deformed slightly due to the heat. The night before, Mary's son had visited. He stated that Mary had taken 2 sleeping pills while he was there, and mentioned her intent to take 2 more and have a good night's rest. He left her having a cigarette in her favorite chair. Her son was the last person to see her alive. A more recent death by fire that was officially attributed to SHC was that of Michael Faraday in 2010. The 76-year-old diabetic man was found burned to death in his home in Galway, Ireland. After 2 to 3 days of not seeing Faraday, a neighbor noticed smoke coming from Faraday's home and called the fire brigade. Faraday's charred remains were found close to a lit fireplace in his living room. Much of the room remained unburned, except for the floor beneath the body and the ceiling above it. The coroner stated that SHC was to blame for the death, even though the pathologist stated that Faraday's lungs had not been damaged by smoke, therefore he would have been dead before his body had burned. The most recent death by fire attributed to SHC was that of 70-year-old John Nolan, who burst into flames under a bridge on a London street in December of 2017. Onlookers tried to put out the blaze, but Nolan later died of his injuries. No accelerants were found on his body, and police were unable to find an obvious cause for the fire. The pathologist in charge of the case stated that just because they have yet to find a cause doesn't mean there isn't one. Nolan had suffered a stroke not long before this incident and was described as vulnerable by his nephew. A second man burst into flames on a roadside later that month, this time in Hull, in the north of England. There have been a few cases of alleged SHC that did not end in death. One of these is the case of baby Rahul. In 2013, in Tamil Nadu, a small village in India, an infant named Rahul allegedly caught fire spontaneously 4 times just after he was born. Each time, his parents stated that there had not been a fire anywhere near him. Thankfully, the child survived, and his parents and their doctors thought SHC was to blame. Skeptics worried that it was actually a case of child abuse, or Munchausen by proxy, a rare mental disorder in which a caretaker fabricates or exaggerates the illness of the child they are caring for in order to gain attention. After Rahul's parents were forced to move by wary neighbors, the fire stopped. 2 years later, the same couple had a second son, who also went up in flames. The hospital was reluctant to release the child back to his parents, but without evidence of abuse, they couldn't refuse. Tragically, the baby died not long after he was released, after excessive vomiting. The death remains suspicious. As you may have noticed, in all the reports I shared with you, except the case of little Rahul and the 2 most recent deaths in England, there are some commonalities in the victims of alleged SHC, one of which is the presence of a flame or other burning object near the body. How these external sources of combustion were ruled out as the source of the fires is not known, but to me, their presence puts the idea of spontaneous human combustion under suspicion. SHC only occurs if the person combusts spontaneously, without an external source of ignition. Combustion is not spontaneous if an external source of ignition exists, which it does in most of these cases. How these people became ignited is the real mystery. Why then has this myth perpetuated? Many of the reports have been shared and rewritten over and over again, losing minor details such as lit candles or cigarettes that would normally negate claims of SHC. Many times, for example the two most recent cases in England, this type of evidence was not found at the scene because it burned away, leaving a gap for claims of SHC. With or without evidence of an external ignition source, proponents of SHC truly believe this occurrence is real, while most scientists disagree. Both sides of the argument have proposed theories as to why these incidents occurred, ranging from poltergeists and ball lightning to ketosis and slow-burning human fat. Before we discuss the theories behind this incendiary topic, let's have a word from our sponsors. Our regular sponsor is Audible.com. If you're too busy to sit down and read, but have time to listen, Audible can provide you with interesting and engaging audiobooks. In fact, there are over 180,000 of them to choose from, which you can listen to on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 players. MCP listeners can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible.com by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. You can also find this link on our Facebook page and website. If you sign up for the free trial, you get a free audiobook that is yours to keep, even if you cancel the service, and the MCP gets the funding it needs to keep bringing morbid history to your ears. Our other sponsor is ThinkGeek, the premier retailer for the global geek community. Express your love of Deadpool, Star Trek, Overwatch, outer space, and so much more with clever t-shirts and other unique apparel, home and office decor, electronics, collectibles, and more. ThinkGeek has great gifts whether you're into science or science fiction, and many of the items on their website you won't find anywhere else. Just follow our link bit.ly/morbidgeek to search their massive collection. That's bit.ly/morbidgeek to get your geek on. Lastly, if you like this podcast, why not sponsor the MCP yourself by becoming a patron on Patreon? There are several tiers of patronage, the lowest being $1 an episode. With that dollar, you become eligible for several rewards, such as access to our patron-only feed, and being entered in our Fleet Street meat raffle, where we give away one morbid-themed item per month. It takes a lot of time to research, write, record, and edit this show, all while keeping it free for you, the listener. When you become a patron, it helps us pay for research materials, and it keeps our lights on. The more patrons we get, the more likely we'll be able to eliminate the need for sponsors. That means no break in the middle of the show. If you'd like to become a patron, head over to patreon.com/morbidcuriositypodcast. You'll have our eternal gratitude. And now, back to the podcast. Then, as now, such a gruesome and mysterious death fascinated many people. With such morbid curiosity surrounding these mysterious deaths by fire, it's not surprising that many people have tried to discern the cause of this alarming and mysterious occurrence, both scientists and the public. Some of these ideas have been quite outlandish. In 1745, Paolo Rolli, an Italian opera composer, writer, and the man who coined the phrase spontaneous human combustion, noticed that SHC seemed to happen more often to elderly females. He suggested that the movement or fermentation of the womb, which may refer to menopause, could cause older women to combust. I quote, "A feverish fermentation or very strong motion of combustible matter may arise in the womb of a woman with such igneous strength that can reduce to ashes bone and burn the flesh. There is, of course, nothing in the uterus that might cause any sort of combustion, but this was the first attempt to search for a pattern in the victims. The rumor that alcohol was to blame for SHC began in the 1600s in Europe. Legal and medical professionals, as well as the general public, believed this. Even in the Victorian era, some professionals thought alcohol was still to blame, but that there was an external source of ignition that ignited the person. They termed this preternatural combustibility and stated that the cells were saturated with alcohol and required only a single spark to burst into flames. By 1799, there had been enough reported cases of alleged SHC that a French physician, Pierre Lair, was able to analyze the cases and identify several patterns and recurring characteristics of the victims. He stated the victims were usually elderly, female, obese, and taken to drinking alcohol. The incidents often occurred near lit flames, such as hearths or candles. The head and torso of the victims were almost always reduced to ash, while the extremities, most often the legs, were left undamaged. A foul odor was produced by the fire, and the room, which was also left mostly undamaged, was coated with a yellow, greasy substance. Lair concluded that spontaneous human combustion occurred due to overconsumption of alcohol, as was proposed by earlier writers. He also ranked which spirits were most likely to cause SHC, with gin being the most likely, followed closely by brandy, whiskey, and rum. The mechanism by which the alcohol ignited the person was not specified, but the idea was that since alcohol is flammable, those who drink it to excess are flammable as well. With Lair's finger pointed at alcohol, it's no wonder the temperance movement of the 19th and early 20th century ran with this information, proclaiming the demon drink was responsible for these fiery deaths. In the late 17th century, alcohol was a major part of life, being a beverage, a medicine, and a commodity. Drunkenness, however, was not seen as acceptable, despite being quite common. With the rise of industrialism, there was a great need for sober workers, and a movement for complete abstinence from alcohol took hold. These ideas then spread to America and fueled the Prohibition movement. Surprisingly, even after the temperance movement and Prohibition ended, the association between SHC and alcohol lingered on. There's a great 2012 article about this association by Colin Dickey called A Fire in the Belly, which is available for free online if you're interested in hearing more. Early physicians also blamed intestinal gases, such as methane, which they proposed could ignite thanks to heat generated by enzymes in the gut. While certain bacteria and enzymes that facilitate decomposition can cause spontaneous combustion in haystacks, this is not the case for humans. If it was, SHC would occur far more often, and other animals besides humans, such as cows, would also be affected. Another theory was that static electricity could build up in a highly conductive person, and with a spark cause them to ignite suddenly. Robin Beach, founder of the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, theorized that some people under certain conditions retain a higher electrostatic charge, which can cause a spark that may ignite combustible materials. Proponents of SHC ran with this theory, suggesting the spark could cause a person to go up in flames. However, without the aid of an extremely flammable material such as gasoline, static electricity has not been shown to cause the abrupt combustion that is allegedly characteristic of SHC. Though sparks from static electricity have caused explosions at gas stations, even this is very rare. Also, a spark is a form of external ignition, which is the opposite of spontaneous combustion. This hypothesis is therefore implausible. A theoretical type of lightning, called ball lightning, has also been proposed to be the cause of SHC. These luminous spherical objects, which can be pea-sized to several meters in diameter, have been created in labs, but evidence for them in nature is severely lacking. Only one example has been captured on video in 2014 in China. There is little other evidence that this type of lightning really exists. Therefore, it's unlikely to be the cause of another phenomenon that also lacks evidence. In 1976, Michael Harrison, a writer, suggested poltergeists could be behind SHC. He also suggested that the victims didn't die, they were taken to, quote, some other place for examination by some other people. Possibly this hints at UFO involvement. Again, there is no evidence supporting either of these hypotheses. In 1995, Larry Arnold, a self-proclaimed paranormal scientist, proposed that an as-of-yet undiscovered subatomic particle known as a pyrotron was the culprit behind the seemingly spontaneous combustion deaths. He stated that these tiny energy units were constantly zipping through the universe and passing through our bodies. Occasionally, they fuse with a certain atom, causing a chain reaction that causes combustion. He piggybacked on the old hypothesis that alcohol makes a person more flammable, and if a person with a high blood alcohol level becomes stressed, they may spontaneously combust. No mechanism for how this occurs and why this particle has not yet been discovered was proposed. Also, if this hypothesis were true, SHC would be more common, and it isn't. This hypothesis was quickly dismissed. In 1996, John E. Hamer, a retired police officer, stated that SHC victims are loners who fall into a strange trance that triggers a chain reaction of mitochondrial explosions by releasing hydrogen and oxygen gases within the body. It's true that mixing hydrogen and oxygen could lead to an explosion, but only if there is a source of ignition, such as an open flame. Also, the hydrogen and oxygen contained in the mitochondria of human cells are not in a gaseous form, which leaves this hypothesis with no support. With the advances in forensic science, biology, and chemistry, the scientific community of researchers has been able to take a closer look at SHC and propose a more realistic theory for these mysterious deaths by fire. This theory is called the candle or wick effect. It holds that a small flame or ember, such as a lit cigarette, candle flame, fireplace spark, stove, or heater, could reduce a human body to ash over several hours in a mechanism similar to that of a candle, where human fat is used up as fuel and clothing or other fibers serves as a wick. Right away, this theory brings to mind questions such as, why wouldn't the person feel the heat, wake up, and put themselves out? And how does a flame that small consume so much of the body? How can it destroy even the bones? The answers lie in the habits, behaviors, and health of most of the victims, and the science of combustion. Fat was used in the past for candle making, so we know it works as fuel for a wick. As Lair noted over a century ago, most of the victims are elderly and immobile or slow to react in some way due to intoxication or illness, and near a lit flame. These observations have proven to be the mechanisms that set the stage for the wick effect. Here is a familiar scenario. An elderly person is smoking or seated in a chair near a fireplace after drinking alcohol or taking sleeping pills or some other sedative. In their sedated state, they pass out, or perhaps they have a heart attack and die. They drop the cigarette onto their lap. It burns through their clothing and burns a hole through their skin. The fat below is exposed and begins to melt, soaking into the clothing and causing it to burn slowly but continuously. The small fire works its way up the body. The melted fat is aerosolized by the heat, and it condenses or reforms as a solid, creating a yellow greasy film on the walls surrounding the fire. As the flame runs out of melted fat, it weakens and goes out, leaving a greasy pile of ashes where the person once sat, their legs unburned, and the rest of the room untouched by the flames. This seems far-fetched, but it has been shown to be true by multiple scientific experiments. It was first proposed by French surgeon Guillaume Dupuytren in the late 1700s, when he suggested that after the clothing caught fire, body fat would melt and fuel a slow and complete combustion of a human corpse. Fire officials have also observed that clothed human bodies tend to be destroyed more quickly in structure fires. The wick effect theory was put to the test centuries later. In 1965, Dr. D.J. Gee, a lecturer in forensic medicine at the University of Leeds, was the first to conduct a series of experiments to test the hypothesis. He found that melted human fat will burn at a temperature of 250 degrees Celsius or 480 degrees Fahrenheit. A cloth wick in that liquid fat, however, continued to burn even when the temperature of the fat dropped to 24 degrees Celsius or 75 degrees Fahrenheit. In 1984, Joe Nickell, a science investigator and skeptic, and J.F. Fisher, a forensic analyst, published a 2-year research project that analyzed 30 historic cases of alleged SHC in hopes of revealing the truth behind these mysterious deaths by fire. The cases they investigated were from the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, and they found several things that contributed to the belief that the deaths by fire had been caused by SHC. They discovered that in the police reports, the bodies were usually found in close proximity to an ignition source, but that this fact was often omitted from the published accounts. They also found that there was some correlation between the deaths and intoxication, or another form of incapacitation, as it made the victims unable to respond to the fire. They also noted that most victims were persons of low mobility due to age, obesity, or illness, which also made them less able to react. Another commonality was the fact that most of these deaths took place inside, where the oxygen feeding the fire could be used up quickly, limiting the size of the flames, and also that most of these cases happen in North America and Europe, areas where the average person weighs more and has easy access to cigarettes, alcohol, and other sedatives, making the wick effect more likely to take place. In 1998, Mark Benecke, a forensic biologist, published a paper on spontaneous human combustion. He stated that paranormal believers are quick to attribute dramatic fire deaths to SHC, but these deaths are bizarre enough without adding a made-up condition to them. He did a large study of photos, police reports, and pathology reports of the suspected cases of SHC, and similar to Nickell and Fisher, found that many details of these deaths had been left out in popular retellings. He referred back to the wick effect, which, while rare, is a real and well-evidenced process. He also stated that alcohol in the body does not make it burn faster, but it does impair the victim's reaction to the fire, which may keep them from waking up. He went on to state that legs and other extremities may be left behind due to a lesser degree of fat on those limbs. He also emphasized that fire burns in an upward direction, and as many of these deaths by fire occurred when people were in a seated position, the upper body was consumed to a higher degree as the flames traveled upwards. In 1999, Dr. John DeHaan, a forensic fire scene investigator, stated in an article published in the scholarly journal Science and Justice that the human body has 3 major combustible parts. The skin and viscera, while not the most combustible, will burn if dehydrated and exposed to direct flame. Bone adds to the fire thanks to the fatty marrow contained within it, though it takes a while for the fire to get to it. The fat is the most combustible part of a body. However, it does not burn cleanly, as it is 10 to 20% water, and as this water content evaporates, it takes some of the fat with it. It then condenses into oily yellow-brown greasy soot on areas with less heat, like nearby walls and windows. DeHaan also physically demonstrated the plausibility of the wick effect using deceased pigs as test subjects due to the fact that they have a similar fat-to-muscle ratio as humans. He found that combustion of pig fat, aided by a small external wick such as cotton cloth, is capable of consuming 3.6 to 10.8 kilograms, or 10 to 24 pounds of body fat an hour. Victims in a seated position suffer greater destruction because the fire remains localized to one section. This is also part of the reason the fire does not spread. In 2002, Angie M. Christensen of the University of Tennessee did a study in which she tested the rate of destruction from fire in both healthy and osteoporotic bone. She also compared the color change and fragmentation of both types of bone. She then compared these results to the human remains of the victims in these alleged SHC cases. She found that osteoporotic bone burns more quickly and consistently displayed more discoloration and fragmentation than healthy bone. She also found that human tissue, when burned, only produces a small amount of heat, making it unlikely to spread the fire. Elderly females are the most common victims of wick effect deaths, which may correlate with the fact that elderly females are also prone to osteoporosis, which may mean the more complete incineration of the bones in these wick effect deaths could be due to osteoporosis. Even in this age of readily available information and scientific testing, there are theories surrounding SHC and the wick effect that don't quite add up. In 2012, Brian J. Ford, an independent research biologist and TV personality, suggested in several articles that when the body goes into ketosis, it becomes more flammable due to the rise of acetone in the blood. Ketosis occurs when the body runs out of carbohydrates to burn off for fuel and moves on instead to fats. One of the byproducts of burning fat instead of carbohydrates is the creation of acids called ketones, one of which is acetone. This acetone is detectable in the blood, but also on the breath. Ketosis most often occurs in people who are starving, have diabetes, or people who are on a ketogenic diet, or a diet extremely low in carbohydrates. Ford tested his theory by soaking pork belly in acetone and forming it into a small version of a human. He then clothed it, sat it in a small chair, and set it alight to demonstrate his point. It burned in a very similar way to the remains of the alleged SHC victims. Acetone is indeed highly flammable, and it is present in the body, usually in the bloodstream. Normal acetone levels are generally higher in children and teenagers versus adults. In a healthy person, the acetone is usually expelled through urination or on the breath, which is why a person in ketosis may have chemical-scented urine and breath. It's true acetone can build up in a human body and cause ketoacidosis, or acetone poisoning, which can develop fairly rapidly. This occurs most often in people with diabetes, drug abusers, people who have been through trauma, under heavy stress, and after surgery. Symptoms include confusion, difficulty concentrating, frequent urination, fruity-smelling breath and vomiting, and if left long enough, coma and death. There is no evidence that any of this makes a person more flammable, however. Acetone is not stored in the fat. It is produced by breaking down fat. Therefore, it does not increase the risk of the wick effect. It's possible someone suffering rapid ketoacidosis might go into a coma and drop their cigarette, or catch a spark from a fireplace and be unable to react, triggering the wick effect, but that doesn't mean they are any more flammable. As to Ford's experiment, he soaked the pork he used in acetone. No human body could contain as much acetone as the model had absorbed, and his argument burned up with the rest of the pork. Plus, if his theory were true, more children and most of the dieting community would be victims of this type of death by fire, as they have higher acetone levels in their blood, and this is simply not the case. Research shows that these deaths are not unexplained, but are instead unforeseen accidents followed by explainable and tragic destruction. What was previously thought to be inexplicable now has a rational explanation, thanks to scientific examination and analysis. The wick effect cannot explain all the cases of mysterious death by fire, but it does explain many of them. Each case must be examined individually and thoroughly if the truth is to be revealed. The myth of spontaneous human combustion only remains because the result is fascinating and the cause is complex. It's a simple truth that if one does not try to prove their hypothesis wrong, the strength of that hypothesis cannot be tested, and therefore the hypothesis is weak. It is through this type of vigorous testing that the truth about many things can be revealed. It is this search for the truth that brings out our morbid curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show @Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram @Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media and give us a rating on iTunes. Thank you to everyone who commented, suggested topics, shared MCP posts, and liked or followed the MCP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram in the last few weeks while I've been away. Thank you Heather, Justine, Morgan, Eileen, Tess, Chloe, Karina, Renee, Alice, Jordan, Colette, Carl, Sally, Zachary, Maggie, Aaron, Franklin, Michelle, Chance, Catherine, Andrea, Lee, Elin, Michael, Katrina, Kelly. There are so many of you I can't name you all, but know you have my sincere gratitude. Also, Chloe, your drawing made me smile so hard. It's now hanging up on the office wall. Kira, Dave K, and Jordan have my eternal gratitude for becoming patrons on Patreon. Also, congratulations to Anne, who won the raffle prize this month. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing, especially on Facebook, so head over there to engage with other listeners, discuss episodes and news articles, and share your creepy stories and cute pet pictures. The MCP is part of a wider creepy community known as the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. As I said before, if you really like the MCP, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can also give a one-time donation by going to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com, and clicking the donate button. These gifts go to the research materials and other things we use to create the podcast. On our website, you'll also find links to all our social media, links to our sponsors, and other ways to contact us. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie. And until next time, thanks for listening.